Good morning, everybody. Can you just let me know if you're hearing me okay? There's a chat function on the right-hand side where you can type in a response. Excellent, thank you. Okay, we might get started. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to our technical webinar about the new plumbing and drainage laws that were introduced on the 1st of July. My name is Summer Adams. I'm one of the Member Services and Communications Coordinators for MPAQ, and today I'll just be moderating the session. So our speaker today will be Ernie Kretschmer from MPAQ. He's our Technical Services Manager, and he handles all of our technical queries about plumbing, drainage, gas, everything like that. As I said, there is a chat function on the right-hand side, so if you do have any questions throughout, just pop them in the chat and I'll come back to them at the end of the session. But yeah, that's about it from me. I'm going to hand over to Ernie now, so whenever you're ready, Ernie.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is an overview of the legislative changes that came in on the 1st of July. Some of this material can be a little bit dry, I understand that, but if you have any questions at all, we should have a bit of time at the end of the session that we can certainly address anything that we've either neglected to cover or we just haven't had time to get to. So we'll have a brief look at the Plumbing Code of Australia, the new laws specifically for Queensland, and just some general information. For those of you who don't access or use the Plumbing Code of Australia, it is the principal document that we use nationally. It's maintained and administered by the Australian Building Codes Board, who are based down in Canberra. It's primarily made up of 3 documents: the National Construction Code, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. Volume 3 is the Plumbing Code of Australia. Depending on what we're doing, we would draw information from any of those 3 documents, but primarily we use the Plumbing Code of Australia. It's given legal effect here in Queensland under Section 9 of the Plumbing and Drainage Act, and Section 9 under the Plumbing and Drainage Regulation prescribes the actual parts that we do call up here in Queensland. We don't necessarily use the entire document. You can see there under the Plumbing and Drainage Act 2018, which is the new act in force, the code requirements for plumbing and drainage here in Queensland are the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code, the Plumbing Code of Australia, some of the Queensland Development Code, and any relevant local government laws that pertain to plumbing and drainage. Interestingly here, if the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code is inconsistent or it conflicts with the Plumbing Code of Australia, we take precedence from the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code. It's documents such as the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code where we can make amendments to override the requirements of the Plumbing Code of Australia. Likewise there for the Queensland Development Code, if there's a contradiction between the Queensland Development Code and the Plumbing and Wastewater Code, again, we follow the Plumbing and Wastewater Code. And under the Plumbing and Drainage Regulation, we call up Section A, most of Section B, and Sections C, D, and E from the Plumbing Code of Australia to be used here in Queensland. And that's just an an easy way to show you which parts they are under the Plumbing Code of Australia. Now, the National Construction Code is free to access and download. You can visit the ABCB website, which I do have on a slide here in a second. You can download the suite for free, or you can view it online at your leisure. Section A has been included in the new volumes. Section A is the governing requirements. It's standard across all three documents. I'll briefly show you that on the next slide. But Volume 1 is the Building Code of Australia for Class 2 to 9 buildings. Volume 2 is again the Building Code, but only for Classes 1 and 10. And as I said before, Volume 3 is the Plumbing Code of Australia. The governing requirements are just basically an introduction and how to use the code, how to interpret it, how to comply with it, and basically use the document. And that web address there can be accessed to either view or download these documents, as I mentioned. So with our local legislation or our state legislation, on the 1st of July, the Plumbing and Drainage Act 2018 came into effect, which replaced the old 2002 Plumbing and Drainage Act. We also had the Plumbing and Drainage Regulation 2019 come into effect, which replaced both the standard Plumbing and Drainage Regulation and the Plumbing and Drainage Regulation 2003. We have a revised Plumbing and Wastewater Code that also took effect, which we also have guidelines to come out. The majority of those are still to be released, which will explain or cover different determinations on how different things are to be done. Some of the main changes that are going to affect your everyday work is they've sped up or made available faster permit times. Some of the terminology has changed, which I'll cover off as well. They've attempted to make the laws easier to understand, and they've introduced a stronger penalty framework, particularly around things like supervision or direction of unlicensed work. They've introduced a fast track process for when you make application through local government. One of the terms that has changed is compliance accessible. Compliance accessible work is now known as permit work, and that terminology was changed due to you need a permit. You need to apply for a permit to actually perform the task or perform the work. So compliance accessible work is now known as permit work. Those timeframes have been shortened. Under the fast track process, it now becomes a 2-day application. So the government have 2 days to make the assessment on that application, whereas it used to be 20 days. But that only applies to low risk building development. And your standard application has been dropped down to 10 days for the local government assessment. And for the standard application, it includes everything that's not covered under the fast track. And with your fast track work, if the new building is directly connected to reticulated water and the sewer system, it doesn't include trade waste, and it doesn't have on-site wastewater treatment or septic or anything like that, it would fall under, or it could fall under the fast track system and therefore go through in the 2 days. But if it doesn't tick all those boxes, if those 3 items aren't present, or you do have on-site, or there is trade waste involved or something like that, then it would not fall under the fast track and you'd be going to the 10-day assessment under the standard approach. Terminology that's changed, as I said before, compliance accessible work is now known as permit work. A defect notice is now addressed as an action notice. Plumbing compliance certificates, you now have inspection certificates and your final inspection certificate. And chief executive approval has been changed to treatment plant approval. Under the new legislation, you have the ability to amend a permit. So if something has changed or circumstances have changed after you've already submitted your permit request, your Form 1, there is now a Form 2 again. It's different to the old Form 2. That Form 2 will allow you to amend the requirements of the already approved permit. And as it says there, you can apply to amend or extend an existing permit rather than having to put in a new application, a new Form 1, and make a new application. It also allows, the regulation allows local government to amend an approved plan that has minor inconsistencies, and they can do that at any stage of the work. And if there's a substantial inconsistency, the inspector may give the responsible person an action notice and require that person to actually stop work and apply for an amended permit because you're deviating too far from the actual approved. Permits now have a time limit. So if you make an application, a standard permit has a 2-year time limit on it, unless at the application stage you apply for a longer time period. If for whatever reason your project has run over time or has been delayed, or for whatever reason your permit is running out, it can be extended prior to that expiration period. It can be done at any time, and it can be done multiple times. As long as it's the eligible person who makes that application, you can extend the time limit on your permit. Unfortunately, if you do let your permit expire, it will require a new application. And you have to be careful there, because if I have had a permit running for 5 years or 2 years or for any period of time, and in that period the law or the requirements have changed, if that permit expires and I have to make a new application, that new application will fall under the new laws, meaning that your work may have to be performed differently. So that's something to keep in mind if you have permits open for any period of time, that you do not let them expire prior to your completion of work. Work that can't be used until a certificate is issued. So this isn't new legislation, it's just a new way of handling it. Work that is installed cannot be used prior to being approved. So a person must not use plumbing or drainage unless an inspection or final certificate has been issued stating that the work is operational and fit for use. It now introduces a penalty of 250 penalty units, which works out to just over $32,500 being the maximum fine for using plumbing work that has not been passed. And that $133.45 is what a penalty unit is worth as of the 1st of July this year. And that penalty falls onto the actual person who starts using the plumbing or drainage that hasn't been approved. Now, this is obviously if someone starts living in a dwelling prior to having a plumbing final or anything on it, they would fall under this piece of legislation and possibly attract that fine if they were prosecuted. Inspection certificates must be given if they are requested in writing. Those certificates now have an approved form, which is the 18A or B, which state that the permit work is compliant with the code requirements. The certificates may also state that some or all of the work is operational and fit for use. And if requested, it must be given within 2 business days after the work has been inspected or it's been given permission to be covered. Your final inspection certificate now falls under the Form 19, and it certifies that permit work for a particular premises is compliant and operational and fit for use. The final inspection certificates can be issued when either all the work under the permit or a distinct part has been completed. So if you're doing a block of townhouses with 20 individual townhouses, and as you're progressing, people are wanting to either take possession or move in, you can start getting finals on unit 1, 2 and 4 and continue working along the line and get the finals staggered as the work is completed. Your final certificates are given to the responsible person for the work, and copies do go to the person who submitted the permit and to the owner. Under Schedule 6, there are documents that need to accompany any permit applications. Now, this is a little bit of a hot topic at the moment. So your permit application is your Form 1. That hasn't changed. But the new Form 1, if you haven't seen it, now requests a copy of a soil classification report if your application includes sanitary drainage. And if it's a Class H, E or P site, it must also include a copy of an articulation design for that drainage. Now, the problem that has arisen here is if a person has damaged, let's say, a drain on their property, they've put a star picket through it or something like that, they've damaged the pipe, we can go out and repair that pipe work under minor work, repairing a broken or damaged pipe. If for some reason we had to make an alteration to that pipe work, it would then fall under notifiable work, and we would have to submit a Form 4. Now, the problem comes on a domestic property if those two things line up and the property is also on a combined drain, it would fall under a Form 1. Now, under the Form 1 or under the permit process, it says that I need to do a soil report. And we're saying that if the property is an existing property, for instance, my house, which was built in the 70s, and I had to change a little bit of drain and I happened to be on a combined service, there shouldn't be any requirement for me to get a soil report because the property is already well established. Likewise, if we were doing work at a shopping centre on a commercial property, for instance, and we had to do underground drainage work, an existing shopping centre that's been there for 20 years shouldn't require a soil test to replace a bit of drain or replace a manhole or something like that. It's an unintended consequence of including that in the Form 1. It is specifically put there for new development or new construction, and we have discussed that sticking point with the government, and the government has advised that they will be putting together a guideline so that it's clarified that issue, that it's not going to actually be required for repairs, maintenance, or things that wouldn't require a soil report. I have had word from the government this morning in regards to this. I don't have a deadline when the guideline will be released, but they are working on it. Penalties have been increased for persons performing unlicensed work or directing or supervising unlicensed persons performing regulated work. These fines have all been increased. They used to be 165 penalty units across the board. There now is a tiered or sliding scale where it's 250 penalty units for the first offence, which is $32,500. Second offence is now a maximum fine of 300 penalty units, or just under $40,000. And for repeat offenders, it's up to $45,500 or a year in jail, which is quite a substantial jump. On-the-spot fines for performing, directing or supervising unlicensed work has also increased by just over $1,000 to $2,600 for an on-the-spot fine. There have been some changes to notifiable work. Now, they're not massive changes. The emergency work, which was the first part of the schedule for notifiable work, has been removed. It doesn't exist anymore. And the rest of the categories of notifiable work, some of those have been combined. So we now have, as an example there, items 8 and 9 relating to backflow devices have been combined as item 7, and 11, 12 and 14, which related to installing fixtures in class 1 and 10 buildings, have all been grouped together now as item 9. So there's less items on the schedule, but the same work is still covered except for emergency work, which has been removed. It's not applicable to notifiable work anymore. The Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code has also been updated. Redundant parts or parts that were no longer needed have been removed and cleaned up, and it's been prettied up a little bit, and its structure now follows a similar structure to what's covered in the Plumbing Code of Australia for a bit of consistency on how the document looks. Otherwise, it's very much the same material covered that was still relevant. And as I said before, those documents exist for variations that we need to make to national laws or codes. As an example of where the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code was recently used, when AS 3500.4 2015 was released, the requirements for the installation of solar water heater panels didn't really work too well up here in Queensland. We had a larger breadth of where we could install them due to our solar gain up here compared to the more southern states. So under the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code, a variation was in place so that in Queensland we could put panels up to 90 degrees to the west instead of 45 as per the standard. The new guidelines that are due to be introduced and released will cover things such as enforcement action. That'll be a guideline covering how local governments can enforce infringements under the legislation. There is a guideline for the installation of tempering valves, temperature control devices, primarily on banks of water heaters. So if I have a bank of manifolded water heaters at a block of units or somewhere like that, that guideline covers the requirements for tempering those units. There is a supervision of plumbing and drainage apprentices guideline to come out, just covering off and being very clear on the level of supervision an apprentice requires. And also there'll be one for the supervision of an unlicensed person performing drainage work. That guideline's due to be released soon as well. Appeal rights have been updated. You can appeal decisions if there is a decision made against you on a permit application, on the application of a treatment plant approval. If refusal has been made to accept a remote area notice, refusal to give an inspection certificate or a final certificate, you can appeal all these if you receive any of them. You do have timeframes of 5 business days for an action notice or dangerous enforcement notice. You have 5 days to appeal that. For all other levels of appeal, you have 20 business days to actually submit those. A new license register. This is something we've been chasing for a little while. QBCC has just gone live in the last week or so, a new occupational license register on their website. So you are able to access that page and enter in a person's details, and it will tell you if they are licensed occupationally or not. So there's not just the database there for the contractor license anymore. It is in a different area. I'll give you the web address in a second. It's not, if you enter someone's details into the contractor license database and they don't hold a contractor's license, you won't receive a response. It's two registers for two different licenses. Other registers in place, local governments are still responsible for holding registers for your permits and inspection certificates, your backflow register, grey water and on-site registers, and a show cause and enforcement register. There you go. I did a search on myself this morning, so it comes up, it gives you the information about me. I'm a plumber and drainer, and it lists off the endorsements that are listed on my license. And it reminds me that my license expires in just over a month, so I will be up for a renewal come next month. The $0 renewal, you should all be aware, back in 2013-14, we were advised that we did not need to renew our occupational license if we held a contractor's license. And therefore, the majority of industry let their, not everyone, but certainly most people let their occupational license lapse because they held their contractor license. It only came out at the end of 2016, I think, 2016 or 2017, that whilst we were advised that, the legislation wasn't actually changed to reflect that, and therefore inadvertently those who had let their occupational license expire had actually been working unlicensed. We got election commitments from both the Liberal and Labor governments prior to that election back then to deal with this issue. Labor won the election and thankfully honoured their commitment, and on the 1st of March this year it was made, the law was changed or amended to reflect that contract license holders who had let their license lapse would still be required to hold their occupational license, but they would not be required to pay for it. So from now on, moving forward, if you do hold a contractor's license and you want to renew your occupational license, you still need to renew it. You still need to go through that renewal process, but there will be no fee attached to the occupational license. If you don't hold a contractor's license and you want to renew your occupational license, there will be a fee involved. And likewise, it doesn't apply to the contractor's license. When you renew your contractor's license, again, you will be required to pay the appropriate fee. So a couple of things that haven't changed. A lot of stuff hasn't changed. Life for the most part will go along the way it did. Before you want to do permit work, or what we used to call compliance assessable work, you still need to apply. You still need to put your Form 1 into local government, or someone needs to submit the Form 1 to local government and get approval before that work can actually commence. And all the conditions and requirements of that permit must be followed. Nothing's changed with the requirements of inspections. You still call inspections at the same times. They still will be the same type of inspections. It's all inspected to make sure it all complies with the Plumbing Code of Australia, the standards, the Queensland Plumbing and Wastewater Code, and any other relevant legislation or codes that we need to follow. It must comply with, as I said, the permit and any conditions on the permit, and it must also comply with the plans that accompany that permit. Nothing has changed as to who can perform regulated work. We did briefly cover the associated fines or penalties for performing regulated work if you're not licensed, but nothing has changed there. And that brings us to the end of the actual presentation. If we have any questions, as Summer said earlier, if you'd like to pop them into the chat, and we can take some time and address those.
Thanks, Annie. We haven't had any questions just yet, but we'll just see if anybody pops any into the chat.
So questions don't seem to be very popular, but moving forward, if we propose to do more of these, we'd be happy to. If people have anything specific they would like covered or delved into a little bit deeper, that'd be, we could get those recommendations or those suggestions put forward to the office here, and happy to put that into some sort of presentation and do something else on them.
We have just had one question from Peter. He just said, any changes to the backflow regulations for bidets?
No, not under the legislation changes. There haven't been any changes to the requirements for bidets at the moment. The backflow standards are currently under review through Standards Australia. I believe point 3 will probably come out later this year, maybe September, October, and point 1 of 2845 is currently just beginning review, so I couldn't give you a finite date on when that'll be finished.
And Jody just wants to know, are the new fines only applicable to applications approved after the 1st of July, or do they backdate?
No, nothing backdates. So if your approval went through prior, so your Form 1 or your your application was made prior to the 1st of July, your application would sit under the old legislation. As I said before, if your permit does expire and you had to restart it or make a new application, you would then fall under the new laws. But no, your application sits under when it was actually made or approved, I should say.
Cool, that looks like all the questions we've had. Actually, no, Jody just has another one. If doing a complete new sewer drain on an existing property, do the new soil tests, etc., apply?
That will have to be, it will be clarified in the guideline, but doing a complete new drain on an existing property, I would think probably doesn't, but it depends on how you are going with the footings of the building. If you're excavating or disturbing an existing footing, you probably would. But don't hold me to that because the guideline will explain that a little bit better.
Cool. So maybe, yeah, just as you said, if anyone does have any other questions, they can email them through to us and we can look at putting together a separate presentation about those. But yeah, otherwise, if there aren't any more questions, I think that's it for us today. actually. So Chris just said, when will that guideline be available?
Chris, we don't have an ETA on any of the guidelines at the moment, just that they're working on them. So I'd love to know as much as you would, actually, but we don't have that information as yet.
Cool. Okay. Well, yeah, if anyone does have any other questions, feel free to email them through or give Ernie a call on the number on the screen. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks for your
Ernie.
time, everyone.